So we have, once again, religion and politics with the Reverend Sam Patero.
The distinguished.
The distinguished.
Just a word about the title that was given today's presentation, The Unmentionables, Religion and Politics. Some in this room will remember there was a time in our culture when we were taught that there were certain things that we never mentioned or brought up in polite conversation: sex, religion, and politics. So today we're going to talk about two of the three unmentionable subjects, religion and politics. And I just wanted to back up a little bit to put us back into the context, or at least to carry the conversation forward from last week, because last week I talked with you about Downton Abbey as a parable of change, the dramatic series that began with the sinking of the Titanic in April of 1912, and the importance of that particular event as the opening event in that long series, pointing out that the unsinkable ship is a symbol of human achievement and pride, and a ship, as many of us know from literary study, is nearly always a metaphor for human life, life's transience and human vulnerability. A ship on the vast sea is very vulnerable. And the Titanic itself, being a luxury liner, exemplified a stratification of social class with a wide range of economic and social diversities represented in the various classes and decks that not only traveled out there on the ocean as passengers, but also as crew on the ship. So Downton Abbey also relates the story of how a significant war, in that particular case World War I, contributed to the total reorientation of British life and commerce through the experience of a war that brought all the classes together in league against or in pursuit of a common goal, unified against a common enemy. And the economic and social transformations that were wrought by a war technology. In Britain's case, it meant the breakdown, or the beginning of the breakdown, of the empire, imperial structures, and relationships. And then I also mentioned that World War II would have a very similar effect on the American culture and economy for all the same reasons. World War II moved many men and some women out of agrarian, in other words, off the farms and out of the factories, through a military system that often took these men and women onto college and university campuses to receive their basic training, thus giving them access to a world that had previously only been occupied by the elites. Only the elites in our society, or people who were going on into professional life, ever transitioned through campuses. And all of that changed after World War II, the invention of the transistor, atomic energy, and atomic physics. All the many things that were a product of that war, of the effort to win World War II, became the basis of the new American economy and required a completely different kind of workforce than the farms and factories had required in the 19th century. So we see both in World War I in Great Britain, through the example of Downton Abbey, we see through World War II experience in the U.S. how wars actually change a culture. I would just suggest that in American culture, probably in some other Western cultures as well, political elections offer a variation on outright war. While they don't usually have as profound an effect on the overall fabric of our lives, they serve to take a measure of who we are and where we are as a culture and a society. There are two mechanisms in American society and culture that help us gauge who we are, where we are, and what the temperament of our time is. One is the U.S. Census, which is taken every decade, every 10 years, a literal counting of heads, and where those heads are located, what the context of each person is, how they're configured in households, how they're arrayed geographically over the landscape of the nation. Anybody who's done genealogical work in this room besides me? Okay, if you want to know a lot about your family, you can learn a lot by going back and looking at the old census records, some of which you have to infer from those records. But for example, I learned by looking at a census record that one child who showed up in one family household showed up in a different household a decade later. And noting the time of year when the census was taken, September, it occurred to me that one possible reason why this male, who had been not a toddler, but had certainly been sort of elementary school age in the first census, but would have been like 14 to 15 in the second census, was probably living with another family or another member of the family during the harvest season, because that was a farming community. So you learn to infer things, and you learn things about the movement of people and the configuration of households. The elections every 4 to 6 years, depending on whether it's a local, state, whatever the office is, those elections that we hold in our culture also give us a sense of the temper of the times. They help us in many different ways, often in a very negative way. I mean, they show the via negativa. They show the darker side of our culture, but they have a way of flushing some truths out about who we are and what our attitudes are. And they help us to sort of analyze where we are at any given point in our history. And it seems to me that while there are many different factors that weigh on the current presidential election season, two that I want to take a look at today that are completely irrespective of any partisan or party politics are the two dynamics of what I call atomization or isolation. They're the same thing. Atomization and fear. Atomization is a word used to describe the process of taking something that is cohesive and breaking it down into smaller elements, breaking it down to its smallest element. And a good example of that is the increasing evidence that we have of individualism in American society. We see it everywhere. We can see it in architecture. You can especially see it out here in the suburbs, although in certain neighborhoods in the city it's just as evident. You go to Lincoln Park and look at some of the houses that have been built within the last 20 years in Lincoln Park, and they rival in size and square footage, they rival anything that's been built in Burr Ridge or Hinsdale or Oak Brook. They're huge. They're humongous. And among the features of those homes is, of course, a private bedroom with its own bath for every member of the household. And sometimes it's not just a private bedroom, it's a private suite. And within the walls of that private suite or bedroom, you will find all the amenities that you would normally have found in the 1950s and 60s. In a family room, they're now in individual rooms. Every room has its own television, has its own computer hookup. In other words, we no longer live in families the same way we did 30 or 40 years ago, because we can walk through the door at the end of the school day or the work day, and we can disappear into our individual cubbies. So we've atomized the family, so to speak. There are fewer and fewer occasions where everybody in the family does things together. They do things individually and separately. And we have technology that continually works to support that. And it's painfully evident when you're walking around in public or anywhere in public when you look around and you see the number of people in this posture with one of these devices in their hands. All of us, myself included, will invariably find ourselves in this posture with one of these devices in our hands doing any number of things. We could be checking email, we could be posting to Facebook, we could be reading a novel, we could be reading the newspaper. But we're in our own little world. We're in our own little world. And because we like it that way, the technology supports further individualization by giving us tailored experiences. We can use services like Spotify to pick our own music. And once it gets a feel for the kind of music that we pick, it will pick it for us. And so our playlist will be limited only to the things that we like to listen to. The same thing with streaming video. And whether you realize it or not, and I suspect most of you in this room do realize it, that even on the so-called social networks, which are neither social nor really networks, you will find that all the ads that pop up on your Facebook page are ads related to things that you have a specific interest in. How do they know that? Because all the retailers are taking stock, both at the cash register and online, of everything that you buy, and seeing to it that you're constantly reminded of how much you like this particular product and need more of it. So this is the culture in which we live right now, and we're getting lots and lots of evidence of how it plays out in the public sphere in an election year. And one of the most interesting op-ed pieces I've read recently was one that came up, I think it was just last week. Megan McArdle wrote an op-ed on the current political scene, and I want to read part of that to you because it's very applicable to what we're talking about this morning. She says, even as Americans talk more and more about diversity, they're increasingly dividing themselves into like-minded bubbles where other people with other experiences and viewpoints almost never penetrate. Social media makes this problem worse. Even if we aren't deliberately blocking people who disagree with us, Facebook curates our feeds so we get more of the stuff we like. What do we like? People and posts that agree with us. Given that Facebook seems to be the top news source for millennials, that matters a lot. It's only natural then to wonder if the increasingly impenetrable bubbles are affecting our politics, particularly the current campaigns, in which two angry outsiders are mounting serious challenges to the major parties. I submit, she says, the answer is a sort of mass delusion. People aren't just angry, they're also out of touch with the possibility other people aren't angry, or at least not angry in the same way at the same people. The result is political chaos. Scientists say one of the most important stages in cognitive development is developing a theory of mind, in which we're able to distinguish other people from ourselves, to understand that they do not necessarily agree with everything we believe, and to predict how those people might behave in various circumstances. Voters in primary season used to have a sort of political theory of mind, casting votes based on their predictions of how other people, very different from themselves, might vote in a general election. Now, she says, I worry we're regressing to a toddler stage in which people can no longer predict what the other side will do, or worse, in which people are not even aware there is another side that doesn't share their thinking. We're losing our sense of the other and our appreciation of the difference it makes. That's the dynamic of atomization and isolation. The second dynamic, which is a much older one and has been around for a much longer time, is fear. Just plain outright fear. It's always been a political force. In our household, we only watch TV, we only watch movies on a TV set, and we only watch movies that have closed captioning because my partner is hearing impaired. So I had to wait until the 35th anniversary of I, Claudius to find an anniversary edition of the original DVDs with closed captions so I could share it with them. It was one of my favorite series when it first aired in the 70s. And so we've been re-watching I, Claudius with the subtitles. And I'm enjoying it immensely, as much now 35 years after having seen the first run as I saw in the original series. And it just reminds me all over again of how fear has always been one of the operative political dynamics. How the Roman Empire used fear to build an empire, and how the emperors used fear to maintain that empire. Fear has always been a political force, always been used by a dominant culture to hold sway over hard-won territory and property. But fear also dominates the dominant. The dominant always fear that anything that was won by force can be lost to a countervailing force. So revolution cannot be tolerated. Difference cannot be allowed. Thus, factionalism and isolation work in favor of stability. Do you see that? That isolating masses of people, atomizing a culture, and isolating the various components of that culture make it far easier to dominate the culture. The worst thing that an emperor could face was an armed, angry mob. Therefore, if you want to rule, it is always in your advantage, to your advantage as a ruler, to keep the people separated. Do not allow them to gather in league, which is one of the reasons why freedom of assembly was such an important principle to the founders of this nation. Assemblies were not tolerated in other political systems for very good reason. They were dangerous. They were dangerous to the leadership. Keep people separated. Keep them suspicious of each other. And in doing that, you prevent mass rebellion. You prevent revolution. So what does a faith community like Christianity have to say about these particular dynamics in the current cultural, political climate? Well, one of the things that Christianity has to say is that you cannot be a Christian in isolation. Christianity is a community experience. It is centered on an activity called communion. It expects, even demands, cooperation, collaboration, companionship, and gathering. You can't celebrate a Eucharist by yourself, can you?
have at least one other person.
Exactly. At least 2 or 3 gathered together. Okay? We can't celebrate a Eucharist just by ourselves. It's not a Eucharist unless there's at least one other person present. Some assembly is always required. In certain households, that principle still holds. I don't know how it is in your household, but in our household, until we reached the age of 16 and received our driver's licenses, we 5 children were expected to be at the table every night for dinner. When our lives became more chaotic and we began to individualize, which is a natural part of human maturation, to individuate and become an independent person, as each of your children has probably worked your last nerve becoming. Okay? As we moved into that stage of our lives, my father still insisted that we would gather as a family for a common meal at least once a week. There was always an expectation that we would gather regularly as a family in order to share a meal together. That's a basic Eucharistic expectation. Whether it's exercised within a household or exercised within the community of the congregational gathering. One of the other things, more importantly, that Christianity has to say to these dynamics, and has from its very outset, especially appropriate to be thinking about in this Easter season, is that whole element of fear. Do we really understand, beyond an intellectual level, deep down in our hearts, do we really understand that the opposite of faith is not doubt? It never has been. The opposite of faith is fear. Faith is a synonym for trust. Faith is not a synonym for intellectual assent to a bunch of ideas or propositions. Faith means trust. You either trust God or you do not trust God. The faithful believing person trusts God. It's operating on what one theologian called the Abrahamic presupposition. Abraham, our ancestor in faith, who was approached by God and whom God dispatched to make the original journey away from home, safety, security. God said, go. Abraham went. With no knowledge of destination, route, goal, just simply went on the basis that God was the one who was sending. God was the one who was sending. Therefore, Abraham said, I will trust in God. I will go. Even though I don't know where I'm going, how I'm going to get there, by what route or by what means, I will go. On the same foundation of trust, Noah constructed an ark. And on the same foundation of trust, Jesus waded into the political quagmire of a complicated religious and political clash of systems that eventually took his life. Jesus surely knew, as any sane human being would know, that if you move from point A to point B to point C, don't be surprised if you reach D. Jesus had to know that at least within the earthly realm, if you followed the path that he followed, especially in the last week of his life, it was becoming abundantly clear to him, so clear that he didn't even speak to defend himself. He just simply surrendered to the inevitable and said, there's not, basically, you can hear his mind working. There's nothing more he can say to his disciples or to anybody else around him. Therefore, with his own disciples, he ends up just washing their feet. That's the best he can do. There are no more words. Hauled before Pilate, the number of sentences they exchange in their interrogation, in their conversation, barely would fill a page. Probably one of the shortest legal briefs in history. He had to know he was on a trajectory leading to death. In the same way that you know if you're sitting in an intersection and see a car coming straight at you, you know what the likelihood is. But he took that route anyway for the same reason that Abraham took the route that Abraham took, Noah took the route that Noah took, and countless other believers took the routes they took in their lives. And they were able to do that because they trusted in a God who promised to be always with them. Always with them. Eternally. A God who, at least in our experience as Christians, we as a community came to see through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. We saw a message communicated to us that death is surely fatal. That's a reality. But it isn't final. But there's a difference between fatality and finality. Every one of us in this room will experience the fatality. Every one of us, each one of us, will die by some means. But we trust, at least we say we do, every time we recite the creed, we trust that that fatality is not final. Therefore, life is not an end in itself. It is only a means to an end. It is not an end in itself. And that has all kinds of implications, not the least of which is that we are eternally responsible for who we are. Eternally responsible. That's what Paul is struggling with in all that complicated language about resurrection bodies. Paul is trying to wrap his head around the whole notion of how will I know that I am me? How will anyone else know that I am? How will God know that I am me? He comes up with the image of the resurrection body. Because the body, this outer frame, is how you know me when you meet me. It's how I know you when I meet you, and therefore Paul seized upon that metaphor and said, I don't know what it's going to look like, but I'm going to be me in the life of the world to come. And we have some hint of that in the stories that come to us through Christianity. Not just Jesus, who comes back from the dead in an identifiable body bearing scars and marks. We have it in others. We have it in Lazarus. We have it in Lazarus, who also comes back from the dead, certifiably in his tomb for as many days as Jesus was in his. Lazarus, who responds to what? His name. He's dead in the tomb for 3 going on 4 days, and Jesus doesn't touch him. Jesus stands outside and just yells, "Lazarus!" And Lazarus walks out in response to his name. And in John's Gospel, that's when it says the religious officials who were there decided it was time for them to take some action. It was time for them. And so in John's Gospel it says, and from that moment they began to plot how to put Jesus to death. Because this supposed good news that there's life beyond death, that's good news only to people like you and me, but to people who are depending on the fear of death to hold their authority and their power, that's the last thing you want. Is the message that death is not something that you need to be afraid of. The thing that gives the armed person power over me is the fear that there really is a bullet in that gun and that it will pierce my body and kill me. It's not death or the weapon that has the power over me. It's the fear that the weapon will lead to my death, and that will be it. If you're not afraid of death, then basically you've emptied all the chambers in the gun. And anybody who relies upon fear in order to win their election, enact their legislation, move their social or political or economic agenda forward, anybody who operates on fear should know better than to try that on us. And we ought to know better than to fall for it. So what does it mean to be a faithful Christian in the current cultural scene? What does it mean to be countercultural? It seems to me, at the very least, if we're to be a faithful people, then we are to be the people who will not cast a vote, make a decision, or relate to any other human being on the basis of fear. And that takes a tremendous amount of trust. A tremendous amount. One of the biggest items in the news in the part of the city where I live is that a very popular bartender who was assaulted in the street after coming off of his work shift in the wee hours of the morning was beaten, was left literally in the street, despite the fact that there were many bystanders on the sidewalk. And it wasn't the beating that killed him, it was the cab that ran over him, because no one would go out into the street and help him out of the street and into a safe zone. No one. It's the Kitty Genovese rape murder all over again. It's that dynamic that still operates, that mistrust. They wouldn't even help the victim. We ought to know better than that. We have a story about that. Jesus told us that story. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. Don't you remember? The story of the one who literally fell among thieves? That's the same story. The bartender who fell among thieves and landed in the street. And the people walked past him. The only one who trusted enough to help him was the Samaritan, the supposed unbeliever. In this culture, it would be the Muslim. The real comeuppance would have been to have checked the credentials. What the biblical end of that story would have been that a Muslim, undocumented Muslim immigrant in this country would have helped that helped that bartender to safety and saved his life. And then, as the reporters canvassed the crowd around, they would find that the alderman was one of those people on the sidewalk. And that the alderman was a Catholic who had a rosary in his pocket, okay? And that this couple over here, they're Episcopalians who worship in a suburban congregation, okay? If they'd done a census of people, we would have had the story of the Good Samaritan all over again. What made the difference? The Samaritan was not good by any stretch of the imagination in his in the culture in which he lived. He was like the undocumented Muslim. He was of a suspect race, of a suspect tribe within that territory. Yet he's the one who stopped and helped the man who needed assistance. And Jesus told this story to make what point? That the Samaritan is the only believing, faithful person in the tale. So what do we make of these things in the current culture? Not only in how we make our political decisions, but also how we make all of our daily decisions about everything that we read and encounter, all of the attitudes that shape our responses to one another, day in and day out. Because we are being formed. I think on your website, what we're doing here this morning is called adult formation. This is part of the adult formation. We're supposed to be grown-up people who are still engaged in the process of formation, because we have to be constantly on our guard, constantly renewing and opening our mind to what it means to be formed as a Christian in this particular culture. There are so many forces arrayed against us. I love my iPhone as much as you love yours. I love all the gizmos of culture as much as you love yours. And by God, I'm an introvert. I love being alone as much as you love being alone. You know, I love living a quiet life to myself. But I also walk the city streets, and I live in a neighborhood, in a building with other people. And I share my life with you and thousands of other people. And I have to be aware of the fact that my attitude shapes my responses. And what it means to be formed as a faithful person means that we must always be about this business of trusting. We have some practice at it. I mean, those of us who live in committed relationships with other human beings know that at the end of the day, the bottom line is you have to decide every moment of every day that you really do trust the other person in your life, the one that you've determined to live your life with. That's why the big sin of infidelity is not the method. It has nothing to do. You can be unfaithful in any number of ways, sex being only one of them. Infidelity in our marital relations is anything that we say or do that undermines our partner's trust in us. Anything we say or do that communicates to the person we love, you know, this other person really isn't trustworthy. That's a word you don't hear very often anymore. Trustworthy. Are you trustworthy? Am I trustworthy? If we gave a little bit more attention to what it means to be trustworthy and began to see that as an evidence or as a litmus of what it means to be faithful. To be faithful means to be trustworthy. That's all it means. Do you trust God or not? That's what it comes down to. When I look at the current political scene, all I can do is trust in God.
Exactly.
You know, truly. Because I'm certainly not getting a whole lot of consolation out of looking at anything going on in the public sphere. Any of it. None of it is doing much to instill trust in me, which is probably a good thing. That's probably a very good thing, because I'll say one thing about the current political climate and the candidates in it. None of them are in danger of becoming one of my idols. Or yours either. And that's probably a good thing.
Yeah.
That's probably a very good thing. It means that at least those of us who don't trust them have enough sense to know that the only entity worthy of trust is God. I can't rely upon any politician to save me from my bad decisions, or to save this nation from its bad decisions. I can only trust God to do that. We have time for some questions, comments?
We're at 11 minutes till.
Okay.
Yeah, which means no.
Sam's preaching today, so Sam, thank you.
Thank you. Carol, did you have one, Carol? Go ahead.
I'm being pedantic, but the other side of the Abraham story is that he walked away from faithless gods. He wouldn't trust those gods any further than he could pick them up and throw them. And if God had not kept his promise faithfully to Abraham, we wouldn't have any relationship.
It's always part of, it's a relationship thing. There's always going to be trust and mistrust in every relationship. And again, to go to the story of Noah, you know, the flood is the result of God's lack of trust in us. So you see, the story of the relationship between God and God's people has always been the story of relationship. It's the story of trust invested and disappointed, renewed, invested, disappointed, renewed, invested, disappointed. But ultimately, it's always a risk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Whatever class is teaching, that's what I'm doing.
Finally, the teapot would get stuck. She's right here and will hear my step. La 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 la.